All right, take a second and prepare a new quad chart for the Iraq War surge and exit. And our essential question is going to be, what were the motives of U.S. force escalation in Iraq related to sectarian violence and insurgency trend that we were experiencing there? So Iraq has really devolved into a sectarian war. That means the two different religious factions of the Islamic religion in Iraq are fighting against each other, and they're both fighting against us. So there's a lot of Sunni on Shia and Shia on Sunni violence, and it really results in a lot of conflict and a lot of bloodshed on both parts. This is just a snapshot of violent actions inside of downtown Baghdad in different areas. And if you look at this, in this blue area, the blue area is Shia-dominated areas. The red area, Sunni-dominated or Sunni neighborhood controlled areas. And then the yellow is mixed. So it's all over the place. There's Shia attacking Sunni in Sunni neighborhoods, Sunni attacking Shia in Shia neighborhoods, attacking each other in kind of joint usable areas. And it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. Millions of people start leaving Iraq during this time frame. Many of them seek asylum in the United States. And it's really kind of sad. When I was in Lebanon in 2014, I remember lawyers from the Department of State would come in and interview all these displaced people from Iraq and interview them about getting citizenship or asylum in the United States, and not one of them was approved. Many of these people live or leave without any type of identification, without any type of background checks. We don't know if they have, violent ties to extremists, and you just can't let them in the United States because of a potential threat here at home. So they lose a lot when they leave because of that, and then they don't have a lot to gain when they get into other places. This is really kind of escalated when Saddam Hussein, his trial is over and he's convicted and sentenced to death. And ultimately when he dies, there's a lot of celebration on the Shia side that causes a retaliation on the Sunni side. And I think normally if you were in class, I'd show you this video, and I don't really have a good way to show you the video. You can look it up. There are several different clips of it on the internet, different news stations. Some of them cut it off just before he they tripped the gallows. But it's interesting, and it's significant in a time frame in Iraq, not only with his capture, but with his execution. What does the country become next? Well, what starts to happen is just this violence starts tearing it apart. The new strategy that we have in Iraq at this time is called clear, hold, build. And the idea behind that is we're going to clear the insurgents out of areas that they're currently holding. We're going to hold on to the cities and build infrastructure that keeps these cities functioning, the way they are. At this time, U.S. forces are living in these great big forward operating bases with HESCO barriers that are 20 feet tall all the way around it, multiple levels of gates to get in and out, and providing all of our own security. So secure military bases in areas that are not secure from insurgent activity from the people. So there's a shift and a divide between the American population that's working and fighting over there and the local population, which doesn't have that, because the Iraqi security forces, their military, their police are not yet capable of providing that level of security. So we try to help them. For the most part, we did a lot of this training with retired Special Operations Forces members who would go over and work for companies like Triple Canopy and Blackwater, and they would do not only the training, but a lot of the fighting, a lot of the securing of convoys and installations and high profile individuals that resulted in a lot of these guys getting into some significant firefight engagements themselves and drawing that industry kind of into light as to what are we really doing. We have a lot of military forces deployed over there, and we're using all these retired guys to go out and do a lot of the fighting. But look at this picture. This is a picture of a gunfight in Fallujah, and you'll notice that the active duty service members are all down and behind the wall, and the two guys who are up shooting and moving are retired military members who are now making a lot of money but doing this in combat. And it's kind of a shift. almost like a mercenary force that we really get a lot of bad press over as time and time goes further. A new approach. So President Bush believes that there's not enough troops in Iraq to quell the insurgency. So there's this idea behind a surge. And the surge is he wants to put more troops specifically in urban areas to stop sectarian violence. And a lot of this happened in and around Baghdad. So he's puts 28,000 additional troops in, and people who are getting ready to leave at the 12-month mark, they had their tours extended, some of them 4, some of them 6 months. So to 16 to 18-month tours, which caused a lot of problems in families and amongst a lot of those deployed. Some of your parents may have been caught up in some of that as well in 2007. But this is a time in Baghdad. It's I think unprecedented. The surge worked in Baghdad. I visited just post surge, not visited. I was getting ready to go back on another tour, but just post the surge, I went into Iraq in 2000 and mid 2008, and something very different had happened since I'd been there in 2005. In Baghdad, the streets were swept. There were flowers planted outside businesses in downtown Baghdad, things that wouldn't have happened just 2 years before because of all the violence that was happening and all the shooting that was happening. So I think that this idea that we're gonna be out amongst the population, we're gonna have a lot of people there, it did work and do a pretty good job. At least at the sectarian nature of violence inside of Baghdad, it stopped that. We have a shift in leadership in the Pentagon from Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld to Robert Gates, and then kind of quickly after that, General David Petraeus assumes responsibility of multinational forces in Iraq, and his idea for winning and changing the battlefield shape in Iraq is really a very old idea, and things that you heard me talk about when we were talking about Vietnam. So winning the hearts and minds is the idea that if we win over the local population to our side, we'll keep them from going over to the insurgent side. It's the very same thing we were trying to do in Vietnam, not very successfully. Very same thing that the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong were trying to do with the local Vietnamese people. This is the same thing that they're trying to do in Iraq. So Sunni extremists are trying to align with Sunni citizens for safe havens, for caches of weapons and equipment, for food and money. The Shia are doing the same thing. We're vying for both populations. If we can do that, we can divide the friend from foe. We can divide the friendly from the enemy and identify where we can conduct those operations and kill the enemy. Again, very much like what we tried to do in Vietnam. Thankfully, we didn't do separate the population from where they were from, like we did with the Strategic Hamlet program in Vietnam, or it would have been a complete disaster. This process is heavily dependent on an idea called cooperative diplomacy. I mean, we have to come to the table as American servicemen, military members, with members of the local community. We've got to work with tribal leaders. We've got to work with business owners. We've got to work with government leaders, policemen, and their military leaders. And we've got to do it across factions so that we can have these talks that start to advocate for our presence being there and helping them establish security. These are some of the things that General Petraeus did. He forced people out of those big forward operating bases, which had really started to resemble great big cities that are completely secure with baseball fields. I'm surprised they didn't build a golf course over there, but they've got shopettes, they've got restaurants. It's not like that outside. It's not safe outside those gates. So he forced people out of those great big forward operating bases and into small joint security posts that are manned with Iraqi military and Iraqi police, and they're doing that in the villages. They're showing the local population, we're all here to help you. And then we start to bring in the tribal leaders. And once we start to get the alliance with the tribal leaders, we start to see a shift in those tactics to the point to where civilian deaths decreased significantly over a period of time during the surge in 2007. And now we try to use this as a platform for de-escalation. The population in the United States is really, at this point, getting tired of seeing us continue deployed back and forth to Iraq. So we start to scale down our commitment there. We bring the surge number of troops home, and we start to set the stage for a complete withdrawal of Iraq. And the term that comes out of this is Iraqization of the Iraqi military and security forces. Now, you've heard me say this before in the Vietnam lessons. That was Nixon's term, Vietnamization of the conflict in Vietnam, training and supporting the Vietnamese security forces to be able to protect themselves. It's the same concept we're taking on in Iraq, training and supporting the Iraqi security forces, both police and military, to be able to take care of themselves and their people. You know what a disaster it turned out for in Afghanistan. And in hindsight, we can look back in 2014 to 2015, the same thing happens in Iraq. A complete dismemberment of the Iraqi security forces. Well, not complete. The Iraqi SOF was still operating, but all the general purpose forces and the police forces were completely overrun by the Islamic State in 2014 and 2015. This was not a good setting or good historical moment for build partner capacity, because it takes years and years to build that kind of capacity in a military. Trying to reinforce the mission, same thing Nixon does with a bombing campaign as we're trying to do by identifying and prosecuting Syrian and Iranian instigators that are operating inside of Iraq. We do this with that strategic strike method of special operations, as well as drone warfare, once we can identify them and eliminate them. Another thing that we try to do is support, I'm real careful about saying this, but support moderates against extremists. And I think we've gotten into a lot of trouble by ever using the term moderate Islamist. And in fact, when I was in Lebanon, the term moderate was something that we could not even say or could not even use, because a lot of these guys are in it for their own advantage. And once they get the U.S. to support them, they end up turning over and trying to elevate their status. And they do that by becoming more and more ruthless. They cross the line from being moderate to extremists. But that was the idea. If we could identify people who had, I think, they want to help their government, they want to help their communities, they would be labeled as moderates. And those who just wanted to continue the insurgency and wage jihad were considered extremists. Very difficult when you're talking about an ideological fighter to make those determinations. And I think in most cases, we've been unsuccessful at doing that. Another thing we did is partner U.S. battalions with Iraqi brigades. And this started even earlier than 2007. But on a larger scale, in 2008, 2009, we selected and trained individuals to deploy to Iraq, particularly in the north, and partner with entire brigades. So you had a kind of a force multiplier of a U.S. battalion with an element 4 times its size. So the commander would advise the commander, the non-commissioned officers would advise the non-commissioned officers, all the way down to the platoon and rifleman level. And it works as long as there's a good transition in time and for that to happen. And finally, the exit strategy. In the last years, the war just gets too much. The cost of about $12 billion per month just to support the war in Iraq. Our defense spending increases what seems like to me exponentially. This pie chart shows the distribution of all military spending in the world. You can see the United States has almost half of that. Looking at our major foes in the world, China and Russia, not even close to the amount of money that we were spending on the military at that point in time. And it's worthy of pointing out that this isn't going toward defense of the nation, and it's not going towards developing new equipment to combat China and Russia if that ever happens. It's simply going to support 2 ongoing war efforts. This chart shows at the beginning of the war on terror in 2001 what our budget was, just north of $300 billion. That's a lot of money, but that's weapons, equipment, manning, pay, healthcare, taking care of families, training, all of the things that it takes in 2000 and 2001 to maintain the military as the best military in the world was about $300 billion. Fast forward almost 10 years, and it's doubled, more than doubled. And that a lot of that comes from developing of new armor, developing of armored vehicles that are safe for explosive IEDs, developing equipment and uniforms that can be used over and over again in combat, new weapon systems that are better and can be used in an insurgent environment, intelligence collection activities to identify and locate where these insurgent fighters might be living and operating. All that becomes very expensive. And it comes to a point now to where it seems like we can't do without this much money. Shortly before I retired, this orange area or yellow area up here was called OCO funds, Overseas Contingency Operation Funds. Anytime you were on a deployment order, you could access OCO funds to do training, to get ammunition, to get new equipment. We bought a lot of stuff, commercial, off the shelf, when we were getting ready to go to combat. So consequently, at least from a special operations perspective, we were always on a deployment order tapping into this money. In about 2013, they started talking, maybe a little bit earlier than that, 2011, 2012, they started talking about going away from OCO funds and just wrapping everything back into the service budget. So no longer could you access additional funds when you were getting ready to deploy. It all became part of the Army, Navy, or Air Force's budget, which made things for training and getting ready for combat with pre-mission type training and checks much more difficult. But it seems today like that we've expanded so much in our budget that the military just can't operate without it. Casualties of over 4,000 in the Iraq War, and you can see the trend really going away, particularly after we determined there's no weapons of mass destruction, that some initially thought it was the right decision, a majority, and then that scales off to where most people believe that going into Iraq was not the right decision in hindsight. President Obama, or at the time, Senator Obama's campaigning for president. He is campaigning like other presidents before him. Both Eisenhower and Nixon campaigned to end the current wars that they were in, Korea for Eisenhower and Vietnam for Nixon. This, Iraq and Afghanistan, becomes the main cry for President Obama to bring the troops home. And like most presidents, like the other two I mentioned, he wins overwhelmingly in this election because the people have just grown tired of watching their military treasure deploy and get killed and wounded in combat. He wants an agreement to bring all forces out of Iraq. The agreement is done before he ever assumes the presidency. President Bush has negotiated this out of necessity, not out of desire, because he tried to negotiate a 10-year contract to keep us in Iraq and provide the type of stability that the security forces truly needed to keep them ready to fight or to build them up to where the point they could maintain everything themselves. But the fact of the matter is, a few incidences caused the government of Iraq to say they would not give us a status of forces agreement. And a status of forces agreement is something that provides the military members safety if they're ever accused of a crime in a foreign country. We have that with almost every country we have troops in right now. Not 100% of them, but for the most part, if something happens, even an accident, in some countries, people can be prosecuted for that. If an accident like that happens, or if somebody does something in the military that's looked at as completely wrong, the status of forces agreement gives us the privilege of caring for and prosecuting those charges ourselves, and not turning over a U.S. service member who's fighting on our behalf to another nation. Because the country of Iraq would not give us that status of forces agreement, then President Bush set a withdrawal date to get everybody out of Iraq by December of 2011. And again, this calls for a smaller presence to continue training the security forces up until that point. And most of the U.S. commanders disagreed, and they disagreed for the reasons I've already stated, simply because we cannot continue to prepare the Iraqi security forces in the short amount of time to make them ready to provide the security situation for their citizens. And again, I think their overrun in 2014 by the Islamic State really shows as evidence of just that. And we should have probably stayed a little bit longer.